Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk today, especially given the time slot. So when I was teaching at Iowa State University, we used to call this the death hour because students used to have allergic reactions to their lunches that would cause their eyes to swell shut. So I hope I don't see anyone have allergic reactions today to my talk because these slides are 100% hypoallergenic. So as you heard in my introduction, I'm Ted Corbeill. So I'm a retired Marine intelligence officer. So I've been retired for about 3 years now. So what you're going to hear from me during this talk is, a unique spin on cyber threat actors. Okay. So real quickly on Verodin. Verodin is a cybersecurity effectiveness company. So we have the first business analytics platform that measures the effectiveness of your security through security instrumentation. So we provide you the evidence that you need to measure, manage, improve, and communicate your cybersecurity effectiveness. All right, but I'm not here to pitch. What I'm here today is to explore cyber threat actors, and I'm going to give you some similarities to some experiences that I had in Afghanistan supporting counterinsurgency operations. Right, so a lot of you, when it comes to threat actors, you might have more technical knowledge, so you might not hear much new from me, but you will hear it in a new way. I guarantee you that. So like you heard in the keynote speaker today, I'm an aspiring new security people. Right, I come from a non-traditional background to get to where I am today. So hopefully you'll appreciate, kind of a unique perspective on what it takes to go after threat actors. So when Marine starts off with our missions, the first thing we do is mission analysis, problem framing mission analysis, where we determine what the desired outcome is, or we define what success looks like. And then once we have that, then we backwards plan from there, given the time, resources, and materials we have available to us. So for cybersecurity, our goal is to protect our digital assets. We see, regardless of industry, companies have digital assets from which they derive their IP, their intellectual property, their competitive advantage, right? And a significant breach or loss of that IP has significant economic consequences and damage to their brand reputation. So as a result, we see companies spending tremendous amounts of money to protect those digital assets. Gartner forecasts next year that companies will spend $124 billion on cybersecurity tools and services. So what we're going to talk to you about for now is, the various threat actors that are out there. So we're going to talk about grandmothers, gangsters, guerrillas, and governments, or as you might refer to them as insider threat, cybercriminals, hacktivists, or nation states. Before I get into that, quick war story. So typically this talk is given by our CISO, Brian Contos. He was unable to be here, so at the last minute he asked me to step in for him. So as the keynote speaker said, I get the opportunity now to speak for the first time and attend my first BSides episode. So I'm new to this space, and so far I really like it. But based on that, I've decided to put a unique military twist on this talk. So you're going to see me juxtapose between my Afghan experience, counterinsurgency operations, and how that's directly relatable to the same kind of threat actors in the cyberspace. So a little bit different than what you're used to hearing. So in 2001, we declared war on terrorism, right? And we launched campaigns in both Iraq and Afghanistan to deny terrorist sanctuaries from which they could plan future attacks on U.S. soil, right? So it should have been a pretty straightforward fight, right? It should have been an easy win. You have one side, you have the mightiest armed forces in the world, right, with $1 trillion. And on the other side, you got a bunch of dudes in sandals and running shoes with some 70s and 80s era Soviet weaponry. But yet here we are 17 years later, still continuing this fight. So I went to Afghanistan primarily to defeat the Taliban. We were there to provide stability to the region and create the conditions for the successful transition of security responsibility to the Afghan army so that we could safely withdraw the U.S. forces. But when I got there, I come to find out that there was multiple threat actors impeding our ability to do our mission there. That aligned pretty well to the 4 categories of threat actors we're going to explore on the cyberspace. We had insider threat from the Afghan army. We had criminals around the drug trade there in our southwest Afghanistan where I was. We had Taliban insurgents to deal with, and of course we had nation states, Iran and Pakistan, that were getting involved in that picture. So very nice correlation to what we're going to talk about. So some commonalities that I see between the threat I faced then and the threat I face now, right? First, it's relatively inexpensive to do some of these things. Whether you're an insurgent that finds an old 500-pound bomb and manufactures an improvised explosive device from it, or you just grab a laptop and write some code, some script, right? It's relatively inexpensive to conduct these type of attacks. Low attribution, right? Whether you're an insurgent that can blend into the populace or you're a hacker hiding behind a keyboard, it's very hard to attribute who's doing these types of attacks. It's relatively easy, right? You can have very successful damaging attacks with low technology and basic techniques, right? And last but not least, they're high payoff, right? You can have devastating consequences in relevance to the amount of effort you put into the attack. And frustratingly, you can stop 99 out of 100 attacks, and it just that one attack overwhelms all the rest of your success. So lots of commonalities then between them. The first threat actor group we're going to look at today are your inside threat, whether it be your grandmother who continually falls for the phishing emails or your Uncle Jack that's tired of being a dull boy, right? They're extremely frustrating to deal with because they can have devastating, demoralizing effects on your company when they're successful or your organization. And it's hard to deal with because traditionally your defenses are faced outward, not inward. So it's a challenge to counter these. There are many different categories of insider threats, but we primarily see 3 types of categories that we deal with here. You have your careless insider, that no matter how many hours of cyber awareness training you make them sit through, right, they still use weak passwords, password 123, right? They still write it down on a sticky note and then post a selfie of them with that note in the background, right, on Instagram, right? You see them, they upload a bunch of data to their thumb drive and then they lose it, or they email unencrypted sensitive documents out. Right? So careless insiders tend to do a lot of damage by mistake. Then you have malicious insiders who are doing it intentionally, whether they're employees that got passed over promotion or found out layoffs were coming or were just tired of being there, right? Or didn't agree with whatever that organization was doing. You know, they do it on purpose and can take the data out or do some sabotage and do some internal disruption. And the last category is masquerading insiders, and those are external people that get inside your organization under false pretenses, or it could be malware or something. It doesn't have to be an individual. So it's difficult. So in Afghanistan, like I said before, I deployed there in 2011, December of 2011, the week before Christmas, for a 9-month deployment. And I went over there with the intention focused primarily to defeat the Taliban and set the conditions for the successful transition of security responsibility to the Afghan army. Well, when I got there, I was surprised to find that the #1 threat actor we had was, in fact, insider threat. The Afghan army were conducting attacks and killing more soldiers and Marines than the Taliban were. And it only got worse in 2012, the year 9-month tour. So we spent significant amount of resources trying to investigate, profile at-risk individuals and figure out, you know, why were they motivated to do this? And it turns out most of them were coerced into doing so. They didn't have anything against us directly, but they were coerced by the Taliban to conduct these attacks under threats to themselves or to their family. But the motivation aside, you can just imagine the frustration it is when you're over there for the sole purposes of training these people, working side by side with them so they can take over that mission, and they're attacking and killing you. And although we put significant security measures in place to try to mitigate some of this, even the most minor incident had huge publicity wins for the Taliban. And it supported the narrative that the Taliban were driving us out of the country. Because if you recall, that fall before in 2011, Obama officially announced the official withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan, and even put a date on the calendar for us. So they knew exactly when they were leaving. So they were making it a point to step up their efforts to try to kick us in the tail end as we were walking out of the country. So extremely, extremely frustrating. And detrimental impact to our brand image, right? The Marines and the U.S. forces are supposed to be almighty, and yet Taliban are winning from these kind of attacks. And last week in the news, I don't know if you saw it, the insider threat continues, right? Security personnel for a high-profile conference with senior Afghan officials and the top U.S. Commander General had a conference, and they were ambushed by their own security detachment. Afghan official was killed. U.S. Commander General survived. So that threat persists. But even U.S. companies and organizations have detrimental impacts from brand image from insider threats. We saw a few months ago the hit that the stock price took for Tesla when reports came out that a disgruntled employee had sabotaged, right? He had been passed over from promotion and allegedly hacked into and corrupted the manufacturing operation system for the Tesla 3 plant. And you can see as a result, the drop in stock price resulting from it. Coincidentally, does anyone know why it peaked on August 7th? Yes.
Isn't that when Elon went ahead and announced the buyout?
You're right, yeah. All right. Boom, right? Elon Musk tweeted out that he was going to take his company private, and boom, right? So who says Twitter's not good for anything, right? But, ironically, that tweet, right, released a whole nother can of worms, right? And you can see their stock price plummeting because, SEC had some problems with releasing, private information that manipulating the market. To me, that's a careless insider, right? Well, not traditional cyber sense, but, a tweet, right? Now you got Tesla took the double insider whammy here and got hosed. So just shows extremely frustrating and devastating consequences to brand reputation alone, not to mention loss of IP from careless insiders. The next category we're going to look at are the gangsters, right? Your cyber criminals. These guys are motivated by money, right? So it's extremely challenging and frustrating to deal with criminals when you must abide by the laws and regulations and they don't, right? It's an unfair fight, right? It's stacked against you when you're trying to play by the rules and they can do what they want. As with insiders, we generally think of it as three types of categories of criminals. Now, granted, sometimes insiders or nation states might be also motivated by money, but we're talking about them separately, so I've removed them from this list. But you can see the general three categories: the professional, the mule, or the getaway, right? They each have different skill levels and sophistication and motivations for why they're doing it. But the professionals are doing it by the money. The mules could be complicit or naive in the fact that they're laundering proceeds from cybercrime. And then you have the youth who are, not subjective to strong consequences. So very challenging. In Afghanistan, we also had to fight with criminals. So quick geography lesson for those that have never been to lovely Afghanistan. You can see that it's primarily mountainous with the Hindu Kush Mountains to the northeast, sloping down into the desert here in Helmand province. So this was our area of operations for the Marine Forces. So why would anyone care about this arid, densely populated piece of earth?
Border.
Does anyone know?
Heroin.
Yeah, opium, right?
Border.
Water? Border, yeah. Yeah. So it turns out that this area of the Marja River, or the Helmand River that flows down from the mountains, this is some of the most fertile farm and arable farmland in all of Asia, or all of the country and in the surrounding area. And coincidentally, the United States from 1949 until the Soviet invasion of 1979 were supporting the Helmand Valley Association, mirrored after the Tennessee River Valley Association. So we built a series of dams and irrigation systems and canals to make this the most fertile farmland. Because in this area, those tribes are essentially subsistence farmers. So these initiatives were meant to increase crop yields so that they could support the larger population. Yes? There are some lithium, rare minerals in and around the desert here, but primarily the reason why people care is, like the gentleman said there, poppy, right? So the #1 crop grown in Helmand province today is poppy, right? And it's not to supply you all with poppy seeds for your bagels, right? It's because the sap from a heroin plant, or the sap from the poppy plant, can be turned into opium, right? So a criminal patriot network, the illicit funds from that drugs, it was the center of the cause of the root of most of the discontent and chaos and violence in the district, because you had multiple actors vying for control of that money in those fields. So you had the Taliban insurgents were funding their insurgency through this money, because insurgents, terrorists don't fight for free, right? They still want to get paid. You had the criminal patriot networks, and sadly, in some cases, you even had Afghan officials all wanted a piece of the drug trade. So it's extremely frustrating, complex situation when you have multiple actors, criminal element undermining your ability to do your operations. We see the same thing on the on a private sector, right? U.S. businesses are constantly struggling to having their operations interrupted by cyber criminals. Last summer, we saw HBO get a series of hacks and held ransom, right? In this particular case, Iranian gentleman stole some unreleased videos and the script to an unaired episode of Game of Thrones and demanded $6 million in Bitcoin in exchange for not leaking it. But she's continued to trickle out, right? But as we know, it takes more than just a hacker to take down Khaleesi, because that season had the strongest ratings. 12.1 million people watched the season finale of Game of Thrones last year. So probably many in this room watched it. The next group we're going to look at are your guerrillas, or your hacktivists. So unlike cyber criminals, they're not motivated by money. These guys are motivated for fighting against social injustice. So in Afghanistan, we had to deal with terrorism. So to me, they're the same, one and the same. Only their tactics different, right? They're both motivated by political or social agenda. Only their tactics change. So terrorists use violence or intimidation, and hacktivists use computers, right? But to me, they're difficult because they're irrational, right? Their actions are aligned to get publicity. So once back to what I said before, you can stop 99 out of 100, but that one is enough to give them enough credence to have, in their terms, success. In Afghanistan, we were fighting terrorists, right? So we had the Taliban. They're an Islamic Muslim jihadist group, right? So they were vying for control over Afghanistan. From 1996 to 2001, they ruled under Sharia law till we removed them from power in 2001. And since then, we've been trying to remove their influence from the country and instill the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan as legitimate control of the company. But as you can see, frustratingly, last month in the New York Times, right, after 17 years, billions of dollars, thousands of lives, they still control or influence more than half of the country. So very, very difficult. It shows you that it doesn't take much to be effective and achieve your political agenda through terrorists. On the cyber side, we have hacktivists. So one of the most well-known groups is Anonymous, right? So a group of hackers that are fighting injustice. We can see several examples of them hacking into government organizations in protest of the death of unlawful shooting of unarmed black youths. So in San Francisco with the BART, and then in Ferguson last year. So very, very difficult to counter this threat. Last but not least, nation states, right? Your governments. Does anyone know what this is an image of? From? Yeah. And what happened? This is a good example of a nation state. What happened to Sony? Yeah, they had crippling cyber attacks against them, right, to prevent the release of this film. So you can see the threat is real. So every major country now is starting to introduce cyber warfare as a legitimate arm of their military forces. But international laws and treaties don't address cyber warfare yet. So as a result, you see a lot of foreign nations conducting cyber warfare activities surreptitiously, right? So it's very hard to attribute what they're doing to it. And we're guilty of it ourselves, right? Stuxnet. So we see this is a challenge. In Afghanistan, we say allegedly? Yeah, allegedly. So in Afghanistan, it was no secret that Pakistan and Iran were aiding the Taliban. In fact, Pakistan openly offered them sanctuary in the south. So the senior Taliban officials had lived in the south, and from there they could plan and carry out operations into our area of operations. There's no better example of that than the village of Baram Shah, depicted here on the southern border. This village in Bazaar actually was split in the middle, with north of it in Afghanistan and south part of it in Pakistan. And from Pakistan, they would stage and launch their attacks into our district. So we would continually conduct offensive operations to interrupt the flow of manpower and materials into our country, but we could never go south of the border. right? We had to stop there. So we were constrained. It was frustrating to try to counter this nation state because we were restrained by rules of engagement or international laws. Does anyone else think of someone that gets frustrated by not being able to retaliate because of some arbitrary line? Right? Dog, poor dog here. So I'm not saying that the Taliban are Looney Tunes fans, and I'm not saying that Warner Brothers supports the Taliban. I'm just noting the similarities here, right? That they were hiding on the other side of an imaginary line with the ball that we couldn't take away from them. Here's another example. Business are also hindered by their ability to prevent nations from stealing their intellectual property. So this is an example of Chinese company, right? They had a contract with American superconductor for their windmills. When they were unable to successfully reverse engineer their operating system, they paid an Austrian contractor to that company to steal it. Right, so he stole it, turned it over to China. They started selling these in the U.S., the wind turbines, and it resulted in them having to lay off half their employees, and saw a loss of $1 billion in shareholder value. Right, but we decided to take action against China, so we successfully convicted them in court, and we fined them $59 million in July. So $59 million fine for a $1 billion loss of IP and income. Not much of a deterrent, right? Hands are tied when it comes to this. So very challenging to deal with threats from nation states. So I think I've done a good example of kind of showing you, the similarities between the threat I faced then as opposed to the threat I face now. One of the keys to being successful to a military to civilian transition is to be able to clearly explain and adapt what you did in the military to what you're doing now. So when I look at both these situations that I just described to you, I see some common challenges we both face with. First of all, does anyone in here have unlimited budget and resources for their security program? Yeah, I didn't think so, right? Wouldn't it be nice if you had unlimited resources? So because you don't, you can't defend everywhere. You have to decide where your most critical assets are, and you have to strategically focus your resources on trying to protect those. But even if you did have unlimited resources, when it comes to cybersecurity, throwing more money at the problem doesn't fix it, right? And even if you could buy the latest and greatest technology out there, technology doesn't always work the way it's supposed to, and it can be very difficult to employ properly, set up and configure. And even if you could do all that and buy all the technology and set up the perfect defense, it's not a static situation, right? It's a dynamic, evolving threat. You see this threat, counter-threat, counter-counter-threat. In the military, we use the term OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act, where you observe the enemy's doing, you orient on what they're trying to do, you make a plan to counter that, you decide, and then you act on that. And what you're always trying to do is continually get inside the OODA loop of the enemy and make them react to you. But the biggest challenge I see in both these scenarios is how do you measure and communicate ROI and success? How do you show how effective you are against insurgents, right? How effective are you doing against the insurgents, or how well do you communicate how you're communicating, measuring cybersecurity effectiveness? Cybersecurity, as I said in the introduction, $124 billion estimated to be spent next year on cybersecurity tools and services. Cybersecurity is becoming a board-level conversation where boards want to know, is our data safe? People and executives and board members are losing their positions now over data breaches. So as a result, they are demanding evidence of effectiveness. So often what you see is some type of executive dashboards that normally includes everyone's favorite beloved heat map, right? So on the left, you can see the flagship product we put out semi-annually, twice a year in Afghanistan, where we were trying to show the measure of effectiveness of our counterinsurgency operations by showing Taliban versus Guerrilla influence. So this was a very laborious 6-month process where you had to take a bunch of subjective and qualitative data and work with multiple stakeholders who own that piece of ground to fight over what color you're going to make it. Is it green we're good, is it red we're bad, or is it somewhere in between? Very difficult. Here's an executive dashboard I found that was presented during RSA in 2016. Looks very similar, right? Generally, you take whatever arbitrary data that you can collect, and you figure out a way to jam it into some kind of heat map and tell a fuzzy picture that you're good, right? That what you're doing is working, whether that be, so very challenging. But in both scenarios, this doesn't necessarily effectively measure effectiveness. It measures something, but it doesn't give you a good, accurate picture of what you're doing is working. So who here has some examples of how you measure security effectiveness in your organization? What's a metric out there that someone uses?
Speed of ticket closure.
Speed of ticket closure. Yeah, right? Reactive, right? What else? Time since last breach? Anyone? What else? Time to patch?
Correctness of configuration.
Correctness of configuration. Okay. So does that generally result in a hit list of all things that are waiting to be fixed?
No, it's policy-based.
Okay. Policy-based. All right. Any?
Dwell time.
Dwell time. Okay. What else? Items that have breached SLA. Oh, okay. Blame it on your third-party provider, your MSSP. All right. That works. Awesome.
Emails blocked versus emails reported to our spam use box.
Okay. All right. Once again, I mean, it's data that you could collect that not necessarily effectively measures the effectiveness of your cybersecurity tools. Right? So what if what we found is it's not necessarily your fault, right? Because we don't have a good way to gather quantifiable evidence of effectiveness, we're forced to manage by hope and assumptions. We assume that the tools work the way that vendors say they do. We assume that you've deployed them and optimized them and configured them correctly, and that they stay that way. We assume that your people know what they're doing, and they know how to execute, they properly follow the processes and procedures in case if there's an incident or to prevent an incident. And most importantly, we assume that we know what's going on in our environment, right? The frustrating thing about cybersecurity is you have the responsibility for protecting it, but you don't have all the authority over the environment. IT can make network changes that countermine and rule your security controls, ineffective. And you might not necessarily know that happened. Sometimes they might tell you, sometimes they might not. There was really no definitive way to know for sure, right? And we know what happens when you assume. So what if I told you that there was a way that you could quantifiably instrument security so you get the data you know to make sure that your security tools, processes, and people are working the way you think they are? So we've instrumented security instrumentation in more than 100 companies across all industry verticals. And what we found, and should be no surprise to those in the room, that the amount of money spent and the amount of effort put out does not result in effectiveness. We see companies in the news getting breached all the time. In fact, our business analytics platform, what we find when we put this in an environment is that less than 25% on average of attacks are blocked. And of those ones that are blocked, less than 40% actually have a correlated rule in the SIM that triggers an alert so an analyst saw it, right? So on average, what we're seeing is 20% effectiveness of a cybersecurity stack in companies once we put in our business analytics, a cybersecurity platform, or effectiveness platform. So that means $2 out of every $10 being spent you're getting your money's worth out of. So we're not saying that companies have bad people. We're not saying that there's bad tools. We're not saying that there's bad processes. All we're saying is there's never been a way before to effectively, quantifiably measure the effectiveness of your security controls until now, right? So we'd like you to think, remember in the beginning when I said I hope that this talk, my military perspective, would inspire you to think differently about security. Well, this brings me to what I want you to think about in terms of instrumenting security. What if you could implement a business analytic platform, right, that could provide you the quantifiable evidence you needed to effectively measure, manage, improve, and communicate your effectiveness to mitigate business risk from cyber? So security instrumentation isn't just new, it's a completely different way of thinking about evaluating security. So as a military intelligence officer, my job was to provide timely, relevant, and accurate information to the senior leadership so they can make decisions around operations and planning. right? In corporate America, I see the same need for demand for evidence and data. Executives rely on evidence all the time to make business decisions, right? To determine where to spend time and devote time and resources. And what we see, all other traditional business functions have a standard set of quantitative metrics and KPIs by which they can measure and show the ROI for those programs or their effectiveness. Why shouldn't cybersecurity be the same, right? Why shouldn't we be able to elevate cybersecurity to a data-driven, quantifiable business function like everything else? So during this talk, I hope I've shared with you a unique military perspective on the similarities between threat actors in a counterinsurgency environment versus cyber threat environment, and got you to think a little bit differently about cybersecurity. So like I said in the beginning, you might not have heard a lot of new when it comes to cyber actors, but hopefully you heard it in a new way. This time, are there any questions?
Coercion of the Afghan army, was there any monetary coercion?
It was, they're terrorists. So generally what we found is we did a study of 21 attacks that had taken place over the preceding 20-month period. And what we found was a majority of the individuals that had done the attacks came from one particular village in northeast Afghanistan that was on the border of a very strong Taliban-controlled area. And those individuals would go home to visit their family, and then they would either be physically threatened or told that they would kill their families if they didn't conduct these attacks. So that's how we were able to determine and start evaluating a risk profile, right? If they were come from a certain village or area of the country, if they recently went on vacation and they came back, there was indicators at which we could then deny them access to weapons or remove them from vicinity of us or something to try to kind of mitigate that effect.
So more data was better. It was very beneficial.
Data, I'm an intel guy, so data is my life, right? I've been in the information business for 25 years. First as intel, tracking what enemy's going to do. Now I do it in terms of cyber threat actors, or in case of sales enablement, what the customer wants. So, great question. I appreciate it. Yes?
Didn't Afghanistan and Pakistan have a very porous border, actually? There weren't any, like, demarcation lines?
Yes.
How did you know who's where?
Well, that goes back to attribution, right? When you have a bunch of people flowing back and forth, there are official, legitimate border crossings, and then there's everywhere else. It's kind of like the U.S. border, right? There's lots of places that people and materials can move back and forth. Sometimes it's hard to separate, refugees from bad guys, as we're facing right now, right? I saw a hand over here. No, a person left. All right, I thank everyone for your time. Thanks for coming.